yeah, and then he said, give me some time to think about this. And he called me a week later. I went to go see him, and he had built the first like neural engine that would be the beginning of Minerva. And then since that time, we've been, training data sets, refining how we use her, increasing functionality, making her capable of providing like a risk score associated with that external profile.
Jen, welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
Good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Where are you calling in from?
I'm in Toronto.
You're in Toronto. Are you
Yeah.
out of a co-working space? Where are you currently?
I am in the Founder House from Acela Prize, which is an accelerator that we're a part of, and they just bought this house and renovated it, and I am sitting in the back office. It's very echoey in here, so I hope it sounds okay.
Yeah, it sounds great. So perfect. I haven't heard of this accelerator. What do they focus on?
So Acela Prize is primarily focused on B2B SaaS. That's kind of their sweet spot. They're here, they're in San Francisco, and I think New York. I know there's 3 cities. I just forget the third one. Yeah.
Gotcha. Awesome. So I really want to jump in this with you because your startup Minerva AI, really cool things you're working on. I think there's a really interesting space you're entering into. But I'll leave you to describe it. Can you give us a quick bio of what the company is and what you do?
Yeah, so Minerva is a financial crime fighting platform using deep learning and automation to quite radically improve the efficacy and the efficiency of financial crime investigations, and specifically a process referred to as enhanced due diligence, or EDD, in the industry, which is a fairly prescribed set of chores that you need to perform and document the hell out of in order to make your regulator happy.
Cool. So I think that's there's a lot of key steps involving that. Who would your end client be? Who would use these kind of services?
Any financial institution, so the big guys, right? Like here at CIBC, BMO, Scotia, that crowd, and then also like the credit union world. They have the same set of obligations to fulfill in many cases, but a fraction of the resources to get that work done. Crypto trading platforms, really anywhere where you're moving money, there's a place for Minerva in your operations there.
Definitely. So, I mean, this space is really contested, right? Especially with all this, everything moving into online. Cyber crimes have been going through the roof, right?
Yep.
I'd love to dive more deeper into that, but let's start with what got you into this space. What led you personally into this problem?
So, oh gosh, a long time ago, I had a career in communications. I was the head of communications for an investment firm, and I wasn't loving my life for my job. And I left, and a friend of mine called me. She was working at a anti-money laundering program over at Bank of Montreal, and said, could you come in here and kind of do the thing you do and sniff around and tell me what's going on, and what are the gaps and what do we need to start to fill in terms of getting this new system up and running and getting people trained. So I went in pretty blind to that gig, as it were. I went in as a consultant, and then I spent the next year just consuming information in the most insane way. Reading the regulations, reading all of the material, the guidance provided by the regulators, really trying to understand and get under what is it that we're trying to do? I know we have these things we have to do, and we have to prove it to you that we did them, dear regulator, but what's the why, and how do we really make sure we're doing that part? So on that particular job, I met my co-founder, Victor Tay, and we both ended up working over at CIBC for a while, also in the anti-money laundering group, and it struck me particularly how similar the challenges were that we saw at BMO and at CIBC, and then when we spoke to folks at other financial institutions, the challenges around the investigation unit they're tough. It's a tough nut to crack. And if I can describe a financial investigation unit to you at a big bank, it's several hundred investigators, human beings, who are looking at cases that are being generated from a transaction monitoring system per se, or, a data leak list, or, someone shows up in the newspaper, have done something terrible. You need to make sure that they're not sitting on your books. That function is so burdened with really manual processes. So imagine if you're an investigator and you get hired to do this job, and you're going to work in anti-money laundering, and you're going to, detect and deter money laundering crimes like human trafficking. And then you get to work and you find out really you're going to spend most of your day like doing Google searches and cutting and pasting. It's a huge disconnect from the purpose of that job, and it's quite discouraging. And because of those reasons, churn in those groups can be really high. The experience isn't really great for investigators. It's quite hard to continually educate and increase the knowledge of a population that's turning over really quickly. That is a problem. And so really, I just wanted to solve the problem. I wanted to actually enable them to stop financial crime. I wanted to enable them to identify human trafficking. I wanted to get out of a backlog situation and get them moving more in kind of a real-time risk assessment. So that's really where that came from, which was like banging my head against the wall with my co-founder at the time, trying to solve the same problem and over, and watching a lot of different approaches fail because we weren't addressing root cause.
I mean, that's quite a step to take, right? Like, you start off as a consultant for these banks, jumping in and putting out fires, and you start thinking about, how can I get proactive? How can I get ahead of these things? There's definitely a lot of learning curves that goes into this, right? Like, especially launching a tech company. Have you ever launched something yourself before? I mean, you talked about being a consultant, but how long have you do you have a history of being an entrepreneur? Have you found things before previously?
No, I have none of those things. What I think I have is I came across a problem that I wanted to spend the rest of my life solving, because I think it's a very important, very worthwhile pursuit, and I just don't get bored. I don't get bored of the subject matter. It's always interesting work. I just kind of nerded out when I got to that Bank of Montreal job, and I was like, this is the coolest thing ever. And I think I met, a few people, a handful of people who, were drinking my Kool-Aid, and everyone else was there just for their job. But I can't imagine anything more important than, putting an end to human trafficking, for example.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's a plague that affects everybody. It's a society has to step in for that. So, I mean, kudos for you taking on that problem. It's that itself. It's a huge problem itself. But in terms of financial fraud and white collar crime, what does it take to get to a point where you're consulting for these big banks? Like, what kind of experience do you need to have? What kind of training do you need to get? Like, what how does that look like to become to work at that level?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can come in a lot of different forms. I mean, some people come in very operationally proficient. Some come in as a subject matter expert. I desperately wanted to be a subject matter expert. And I've been lucky enough to work with some actual subject matter experts. So, I really busted my ass to get to where I needed to be from a knowledge level. And then if I had any superpower, it was being able to translate, here's what the requirements say, but here's what it looks like in practice. And then if you can deliver, results, then people are much more willing to talk to you. And also it's not a huge community, right? The anti-money laundering banking community, not so very big. So you are kind of running into the same folks over and over.
Yeah, I can imagine. There's these niche communities that exist that especially in a very advanced professions that you get networked really into, and it's so important to keep in touch with everybody. So talking about this, like cyber crimes, it's such an evolving thing because the speed of innovation, the speed of technological change is as rapid, right? The last 10 years have been such a crazy whirlwind of change, right? How do you how do you keep up with this? As someone who thinks about this, how do you keep up with the speed of technological change? How do you keep yourself current?
So there are a few components to that, really, and one of them is just understanding kind of what's happening around you. So from a perpetrating financial crimes perspective, there is no end to the innovation and creativity of the criminals. They're always going to be ahead, and our job is to anticipate, predict, identify, and be able to get there a whole lot quicker than we do today. I mean, if you looked at like the financial criminals as having the same kind of technology as the Avengers, then that makes the financial crimes folks chief wiggles, right? Like, it's not a fair fight. We're dealing with some fairly antiquated processes. And so that was kind of the first hurdle, which is like, if I look at how that works today, how do I remove all the busy work, all the stuff that's a time sucker but doesn't actually identify the risk or help me solve this problem? And we went at that from an automation perspective. And then what we have found useful in trying to keep pace with the innovation and evolution of financial crime is when we look at a client, whether it's a person or a company, trying to look at that company very holistically, like basically asking the universe, who is this and how do they operate in the world? And so what Minerva does is casts a very, very wide net. She's going through billions of data points in a blink of an eye in order to identify the target, use the contextual information around the target to find all the other targets that match that contextual information. So not just a name or a DOB, but much richer information. That information comes back, and what I get to look at and what I get to understand is, sure, I can see all the components from a regulatory perspective that I need to have, but then I also understand the total risk of this person or this entity quite holistically, because I'm looking at you in the news, and I'm looking at what you're saying in social, and I'm looking at whatever watch lists, if you're sitting on any of those, what are those telling me about you? Are there any legal cases outstanding? Has there been any disciplinary action issued by a regulator for any particular reason? That stuff is really, really rich, and today it is a pain in the face to get all of it together. And then I guess
that sounds. Sorry, go ahead.
The other component of Minerva is then being able to, learn and understand from the data that she's consuming to be able to make predictions or pre-identify emerging patterns and profiles of what risk might look like, and start identifying those, and then looking for an operator to confirm whether she's got that right or not, which is also incredibly useful.
First of all, I love the fact that you call your technology a she. You're personifying it, right? So, let's talk a little bit about that, right? So, is this like almost like an AI you're training to look for a like analysis almost, right? Train it to look at certain models of penetrations or certain things that have done.
Yeah, think of it. Imagine imagine if you had the superpower to find your actual target and then cross-reference every piece of data that is available about them against that profile to find out if that information actually belongs to that target, right? And that's really meaningful and a really quite a long piece of work that gets done today that gets to under the 2-minute mark with Minerva. So yeah, it's quite accelerated.
I mean, that sounds pretty cool. I love the idea that AI is almost seen as like an augment to human capability, right? Like it is databasing and going through information so much quicker than we can, and augmenting what we already naturally do at a higher capacity.
Yeah.
So let's talk about a little bit about building this thing, right? So you're a like almost a consultant for these banks. You were doing financial fraud detection and all these different activities. How did you go from there to like building this AI that can go out and do this at a higher capacity in real time?
So a few years ago, I guess quite a few years ago now, Victor and I were talking to a friend of ours out at McMaster University, and I was having my usual rant about work, and having my like, if I had a magic wand, this is how I would do it. And my friend said, "I think I might know your magic wand," and introduced us to Damien, who is our CTO. And so we went out, as founders do, for beer and pizza, and had a long chat about what it was we were trying to achieve. And Damien was just finishing his master's in cancer research, where he had built an AI to do intelligent data aggregation and then analysis to help correlate, a million disparate data points around the same type of cancer or around the same type of drug being used to treat that cancer. And so when I told him what we were after, he immediately saw the corollary between the two problems. And man, when was that? 2017, 2018? And and then he said, "Give me some time to think about this." And he called me a week later. I went to go see him, and he had built the first like neural engine that would be the beginning of Minerva. And then since that time, we've been training data sets, refining how we use her, increasing functionality, making her capable of providing like a risk score associated with that external profile of data, literally labeled hundreds and thousands of data points to teach her. And now it's a more of a, we have our own app called Minerva Learn, which is an ongoing training platform where she presents me with something and says, "I think it's this," and I either confirm, or correct. And so she has a continuous flow of data coming in, and and we have controls around things like watching for bias being introduced into any of the results, because that would be a big no-no. And the reason we wanted to consume data from source was because we didn't want to have anybody in the middle curating or touching or tainting the data in any way with their view or their opinion. We just wanted it to come in kind of clean that way and teach her from there.
That's so interesting. You got this friend of yours that you met that built out this model. You started training it. So this is really interesting to me because we hear a lot about AIs now. The technology of building an AI is not too sophisticated. Like you can actually launch a neural net, you can launch this engine, but really what's important is the data you feed it, right? And how you aggregate that data and how you refine it, right? And how you label the data points and things like that. That's really the sophistication behind the engine now, right? Where like if you're launching something like this, like go ahead.
Having multiple layers, multiple neural nets sitting on top of each other that are then you're able to vertically integrate, right? Which is where you get the richness of information instead of a bunch of binary questions, right? We started with machine learning models and then introduced, natural language processing and deep learning as she matured. It sounds weird now when I say she. Anyway, as she matured, and so she now understands things like when she reads a news article, she understands context, sentiment, risk typologies in financial crime, which is quite, actually quite amazing thing for her to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, where would you go about getting data, like accurate data for this? I mean, obviously you were in the field and you understood this, but is this data like readily accessible? Is there databases like paid databases? Is it behind like a security code? Like, where would you get the data sets to?
Yeah. So there's lots and lots of rules about taking and collecting and aggregating data. So two things. Minerva is a permission-based, I don't know what else to call her. She's permission-based in terms of how she identifies and aggregates data. So she will engage with the security protocol, ask if she's allowed to scrape or take the information. If the answer is no, we have our own search engine that goes in and just indexes the link. So the link will come back to the analyst and they can access the information as a human being where a bot could not. In terms of identifying sources, we kind of just we started with the regulators. So sanctions lists. They're free, they're public, they're posted by a series of relevant regulatory bodies. They're responsible for updating them. So we consume those through an ongoing, like a regular feed, and all of our searches happen in real time, so there's no stagnant data in any of the reporting. And then the news, she looks at 50,000 some odd news outlets globally. In multiple languages, in 36 languages, and we'll do some translation for you. And really the purpose of that is to understand, if publication X says this, does the rest of the world kind of agree on that? Or is there multiple opinions about, what is particularly true? And being able to cross-reference them to try and get to some kind of ground truth. And a lot of our data, some from the government websites, they are, woefully behind, and we're indexing massive PDF libraries, things like that. We ingest SEC filings, and we cut up and parse them into the bytes that we need them to be in. We pay for a select number of data sources, usually specific to business ownership, because that can be a little more challenging to access on open source. But yeah, there's just a little bit of everything in there.
This seems like quite a bit of work to get situated and started, like a lot of manual work to get the data, refine it, and get it set up. How long have you been doing this? How long has this project been running for?
So we started our build in 2018, I think. I know I'm screwing those up. It was 2017 or 2018. And then we didn't really pop up on the radar until like this time last year. So this time last year, we were accepted into NextAI Canada, which is an accelerator. And then from there, we got picked up by Acela Prize, which is where I am now. And then we were just kind of off to the races. And the leap in accuracy for Minerva from where we were a year ago when we entered the program to where she is today are night and day.
Yeah, I can imagine. A lot of these technology companies, a lot of these projects, they work on an exponential curve, right? In the beginning, it's very slow methodological progress, as it's labor intensive. But really, as you get more and more powerful, more built up, you follow this exponential curve. Where are you at now? Like, how does the situation look like? Are you client facing? Are people actually using this yet? Are you still developing? What's your status?
So we are live and in market. We have clients and we have a number of pilots that we're running, which is probably the best thing ever in terms of getting feedback that you can really use to iterate and improve the experience for the user. So yes, so that is going on. And then really what we're looking at now is the product roadmap and what is the next most useful thing on the menu of things that we should be attacking. So when I look at that workflow process of an investigation or enhanced due diligence, once you've been risk rated, by your bank, and everyone is low, medium, high, red, yellow, green, like pick your methodology. Those who sit in the higher category, and it could be for a number of reasons. It doesn't mean necessarily mean that you're risky. It just means your profile has certain markers. Those folks have to be reviewed on a fairly regular basis by law. You have to take a look at them. And that process is a pain in the face. It's called periodic review. And it's really, again, the human being going in and kind of poring over a year's worth of information over a single client. It's manual, painful work. And so we're looking at the automation of that and trying to use like an enhanced due diligence record from their first search to issue a delta for their second, to say if there's been any material change between, then and now.
So, okay. So, like going to this mode of getting it client facing, right? Was there any initial challenges getting people to use this, or even demoing it, or yeah, it's very sensitive data and sensitive information, right? How did that look like?
It's the first real big hurdle is trust. We're a startup. I think the only reason some folks agreed to even let us in the door to have a conversation was because they knew us from previous roles, right, in banking. Otherwise, there would have been no way. So if you look at, for example, you have to scan every client who opens an account against sanctions lists to make sure that they're not sitting on one of those, because you can't do business with them. So every bank on earth pretty much has to do that. If you get it wrong, punishment is quite severe, both from a reputational as well as from a financial perspective. So the big players like LexisNexis and Thomson Reuters have dominated this space for a really long time. And they have these deep, long legacy relationships with financial institutions. The financial institutions pay a small ransom to use that particular service, but they're very comfortable with the service they're getting, even though there's gaps in their data. So, for example, a politically exposed person in Canada has a slightly different definition than one in the US. So some of those big engines, those big market players, wouldn't necessarily identify the mayor of a small Ontario town as qualifying as a PEP, but they do in our context. So we're using things like inference and occupation and the contextual data to determine if someone could be a PEP outside of this, definition of being a political operative in some way. So getting banks like comfortable with this is actually a very simple task that's being performed, and yes, it's high stakes poker. You can't get it wrong. Is a challenge. I would say that just establishing yourself as credible and as the AI as reliable is probably the most challenging piece.
Yeah. So going back to data and privacy, we've had a number of telehealth and healthcare companies come through here, and they also deal with very private, sensitive data, and they have to comply with PHIPAA and HIPAA compliance, right, which is a regulatory system that defines what happens with medical data. Is there a particular compliance law or a particular regulatory body that oversees like this kind of regulation, or this kind of data?
Yeah. So I guess the answer is sort of, but also probably very soon something more official. So if you think about it, we're pulling from open source data. So that information is out there in the world. However, aggregating it is not necessarily okay. In the context of a bank assessing the risk of a client, they're entitled to that information to make a risk assessment about the client. So what we do with Minerva is we're using a technology called Private AI. It's a venture sitting next to me here. And their software makes Minerva, especially the humans at Minerva, blind to the information. So I know that Bank X is conducting a search, and I know they've generated a report, but I'm not privy to any of that data. And only their user key can unlock and match the personal information to the actual person. We don't do that for them. So for us, we really designed with GDPR in mind, because it was certainly the most rigorous, legislation out there in terms of protecting privacy. So that is where we are now. Yeah. Will we be engaging, hopefully, with the Privacy Commissioner at some point? Yes, that would probably be really, really good. But yeah, I think it's really important, and there's no human at Minerva who needs any of that information for any reason. So, Minerva, the AI, can learn from it, but she can't share it. And I think that's important too.
It's really interesting that you're complying with the GDPR. Even though you're North American, you're a Toronto-based company, because we had recently a company from Mexico that moved to Toronto to start its data play. Technology play. And the reason they came here is so they can purposely comply with HIPAA and PHIPAA compliance, because they know if they can hit that standard, the rest of the world, they automatically accept them. So, it's interesting that you're saying GDPR is kind of the complementary body there, right? So going back to like data and data privacy, I mean, this is a really key issue in today's lexicon, right? A lot of people don't really understand how much data is available, how much can be scraped, how can be utilized, especially by people who want to do bad things by negative actors, right? In your field of work, has anything like any shock values happened? About like you came across things, any stories you can share about about what happened, what kind of issues can happen if if people like you are not out there like looking out for people?
I don't think we have anything like sexy or dramatic in that way. I think that I think one of the things that strikes me is that Google's not private in any way, shape, or form, but hundreds of banks use bank to conduct searches on their clients. That's bananas, right? So that's information I wouldn't want anyone to have. That's kind of a crazy thing to do. I often overhear people having conversations about how privacy is not a big deal and how it's improving their lives or their shopping experience or whatever. And I will admit that I have entered conversations to which I was not invited to share some thoughts on what it means when anyone can identify the number on your phone as a user with you as a person, and how that could unfold for them. And I think that can be quite shocking for folks. For us, we're not here to vilify or get anybody in trouble. We are trying to provide the right relevant information to assess the risk of a client when there's been a triggering event. So, for example, I don't know if you know this, but so you walk into a bank, right? And you show up with your driver's license and your face, and you open an account. Great. So off you go, you've got your account. That was pretty easy. Now, as you transact with your institution or through your institution, they do transaction monitoring. There's behavioral thresholds and financial thresholds. I think everybody kind of knows that because everybody talks about the 10,000 trigger. So that spits out an instance of saying, this transaction kind of fell outside of our parameters. Could somebody please take a look at it? It doesn't necessarily indicate that they've done anything wrong. It just means it fell outside of certain parameters, and somebody should just check to make sure that it's okay. And so I'm all over that in terms of equipping banks and investigators with the tools that they need to, one, only get the information relevant to a financial crime investigation. I don't need to know everything and anything about you. I need to know, in the context of this investigation, are you a bad actor or are you a good actor? I think I kind of went off my topic there, but I don't think we're violating anyone's privacy because we are helping the banks fulfill their regulatory obligation, but we are not privy to that information. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think you hit some interesting points here that I want to dive into. So you talk about, people being good actors versus bad actors. Is there any gray zones that are existing? Like people just collecting data just for the sake of it? I mean, there's these data brokerage industry that I've been following, really interesting, right? There's a recent article came out that even Facebook buys data from data brokerages because they have more data aggregation points than even like Facebook, which is like a known huge aggregator of data, right? So there's this huge gray market of data being sold and bought and traded, and it's been long for a long time. Back in the day, it used to be like debt collection, right? Debt collection agencies will buy people's debt information and try to collect on it, and they would buy these lists, and it's all like a gray market. Nowadays, it's moved on from there, right? I don't think people really understand like the cookie crumbs of data that's available out there that people are taking and aggregating, right? Are you following this market at all? Anything that sticks out to you that's like really harrowing, like really a questioning?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I really do only think about it in the context of Minerva and what does it mean for us. In order for Minerva to ingest data, we have to know that the data is clean. We have to know that it is not stolen, that it hasn't come from or been compromised in any way. And that's a bit of a to-do, as you can imagine. And lots of folks who are aggregating and selling data, I don't think fall into that category around guarantees about the legitimacy of the data and how it was acquired. All of the legislation around privacy and identity speak to things like purpose and use. And you need this information for a real purpose or no. If you don't, you shouldn't have it. And I'm fine with that. We don't purchase data from those sorts of operations. Not to say we wouldn't ever. It just hasn't been what we've been up to, and we don't sell any of our data. That would be a terrible
Gotcha.
business.
So going back to this, right? No, definitely. But the market exists, and it's kind of a little terrifying what's possible, right? So there's this holy grail in blockchain, right? The idea that we can almost NFT ourselves, like individuals on a blockchain, and then you can have all your passport, your license, all your government data there, and then it can be an aggregator, like almost like a vault of data that can come into this I guess vault, and then that can be your security key, right? You use this data to verify yourself and interact with other things. So then you become like the wholesale keeper of your data, and then you can verify other systems that use it. It's like it's a very like out there idea, but it's been like a holy vision that people have been moving towards, right?
Well,
and a lot of governments are looking into this, like e-citizenship. Sorry, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. No, you're right, and I think of it in a couple of ways, which is, would I prefer that to be the owner of my identity, the manager of my identity, and be able to securely, release or send that information somewhere if I want to, and then we just have to assume that nothing bad will ever happen, which is highly unlikely, but that's true of every possible model, versus a bank owning my identity and a financial institution repping me to my car salesman or my mortgage broker or whatever. I don't think I'm down with that. So it's not a half bad idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Estonia broke ground with their e-citizenship program, right? So now they can have a digital citizenship that you can prescribe to. You can actually buy a citizenship to Estonia and vote there, and have this whole portal access. And Canada is really interested in this. There's think tanks in Canada now researching how we can create like an e-citizenship portal for the clients, right? And one of the main issues behind this is that in Canada, especially, we're so reliant on the government is reliant on the banks to reach the people. And there's a bunch of people who are considered unbanked, even in a country like Canada, who don't have bank accounts. And even like like CERB or like the all the government grants and availability, if you don't have a bank account, you were not qualified for it, right? And secondarily, talking about these government programs, there's been a lot of people who are not qualified who took this, a lot of bad actors who manipulated the system to get data, and now it's the CRA and all these systems are now back now again not proactively on a backlog going through this to try to figure out who these back actors were, right?
Yeah.
COVID was like a huge push for seeing how vulnerable our systems were, and like how the government itself doesn't really have a tally on its citizens and can't even help the citizens if it need to. It needs to rely on this private on the private banks in order to reach its citizens, right? So I think this really opens up a huge market for you with Minerva, right? Like now there's a huge search going on for what's happened to all this money, where it all go to, what, to go to the right people. Is there something that you would step into?
Well, I mean, in this particular situation, especially when you have a number of people opening accounts to collect something like CERB, which makes total sense. If that's the only way you get to eat or pay your rent, then you should be entitled to that money. What should probably be happening, though, during that issuing process is doing enhanced due diligence on the people especially if they're net new to you as a banking institution, doing a little EDD to make sure that there are no previous instances of fraud or money laundering, and again, asking the big question: what does the world have to say about this individual? At a very robust and detailed level. Will that information come to light? Often it does. Right? Depending on the risk tolerance of the institution. If you stumbled across several news articles where somebody was a named party in a fraud scheme, I might think twice about whether I would continue that relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there was a recent news article came out, there was somebody who was working within the government as a family, as a husband and wife, who defrauded the government like $16 million or $1.6 million, something around that, in that range, by creating fake bank accounts and direct depositing themselves this money, right? So during this past year, over $1 trillion in Canada alone was printed out. In order to support, quote unquote, printed out, in order to support all these government grants and incentives and programs. So I would imagine, right now there's this field is blowing up, right, of people who are now being contracted or looked into to kind of trace and look into. So I think you're in a really rich industry, right, and moving into it. Do you see a change, through in the post-COVID world? Where your solution is more in need? Like, are you seeing more outreach towards you? Are you seeing an ease of access of talking to clients? Like, has there been an environmental change after COVID?
So I think the environmental change that we've experienced has actually been with smaller, mid-sized financial organizations, crypto platforms, neobanks, that kind of smaller crew. Want to implement those kinds of controls quickly. There seems to be a bit of awakening in that community, and you can thank regulators everywhere, because they issued some pretty fantastic fines in various jurisdictions to get people on side. And I think that's the kind of action, both from a regulatory perspective, that we need to get folks to do what we need them to do. And by folks, I mean instant banking service providers. What was I going to say about that? So from a larger banking perspective, I haven't quite seen that shift. I mean, we're having some interesting conversations, but from the big FI, it's like turning the Titanic, as they say. It's really, really challenging.
Yeah. I mean, it's a huge, it's a huge ship you have to slowly maneuver out of the way. The financial industry, is going through this huge uplift now. With the fintech industries, all these companies coming up and just taking sections of the problem and moving away. In this industry that's being heavily augmented now modernized through technology, there's definitely holes that need to be filled, right? Even now with the because through COVID, a lot of the banks, a lot of their the banks, the CRA, the government employees are now working from home under the home networks which are not secure and things like that, right? So we were talking to penetration testing companies who came in here, cybersecurity firms who are now concerned about this, right? What is your chief concern, in this environment that people have to look into, institutions have to be mindful of? Is it their employees working from home? Is it Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I would be again like I'm going to assume that most bank employees are likely working through a VPN, so they're not working off of a home network. Um, and yes, so that is, and if they are, that's probably not great. And so I would be concerned around things like information being intercepted. That would be the absolute worst case scenario. Uh, what else is happening in there that would be of concern to us? I think, I mean, okay, sorry, I'm a little torn because I think we've been talking about, we as society and certainly bankers have been talking about the validity of work for home for over a decade.
Yeah.
And then COVID made it necessary. And then somehow a 10-year-old, 15-year-old problem magically was solved in 6 weeks. So there's lots of potential there to, be nimble and move quickly. Sadly, I think that's still really tied to its impact to revenue streams and less so on the risk side. And with that many bank employees working from home, my fears would be, in no particular order, the security of the data that they're accessing and transporting to and from their financial institution, from whether it's their home network or their VPN. The length of time it takes to do that work from your home laptop or computer, or whatever you were sent home with, making a long investigation process longer and thereby falling further behind in terms of caseload and that backlog of stuff that you need to take a look at growing and growing and growing. That's just a big giant pile of unmitigated risk sitting there. So that would give me concern. And then it makes things like, finding the man and his family or people who are opening fraudulent accounts to collect money all the worse because you're not finding it until 2 to 3 years later.
Jeez. I mean, a lot of complexities there. Let's talk a little bit more about, what does the future hold for you and your industry, right? What does Minerva look like in our fullest form, in our final form, right? For you, what is that vision?
Oh my goodness, I love this question. So in my future world of like 5 to 10 years out, Minerva is a couple of things, which is her predictive powers are really, really, really finely tuned and great at identifying risk, especially relationship risk. So as I try to understand who a client is, who they do business with, and do any of those characters impact my risk assessment, being able to predict which relationships would be problematic would be incredibly useful. On a very big stage, I would like to see transaction monitoring programs married to the contextual data of a Minerva in order to truly identify when you have a problem, when you don't. Transaction monitoring is an incredibly blunt tool. I want to see all transactions between X and X spit out an alert. I want to see transactions that act this way and act this way spit out an alert. It generates a lot of noise, and then it becomes very hard to identify real risk. And then you, as the institution, grow concerned that you're going to miss something because of that. So now every investigation is as important as the last. So there's no application of a risk-based approach, and you can't allocate your resources to address the real risk. So I think in the future, if your detection systems are this marrying of the client contextual data with the transactional information to say, this is really, really out of character for Bob, or this is something that Cindy does all the time, and we've actually spoken to her before, and we're totally comfortable with this behavior. I think that's really important. I think the use of AI in order to really fine-tune market segments or client segments is quite important. So being able to look at, client A over time and how they behave. And then when we talk about client segments where everybody is the same, we're actually talking about same for same. Like maybe we'll look at them by postal code, or maybe we'll look at them by bank holdings, or maybe we'll look at them demographically. That kind of information would be way more useful in the future. So I want Minerva to make risk assessment real time. I want to be able to spit out an alert that says, based on this information, here are all the hallmarks of human trafficking. It's time to engage law enforcement or your regulator and go pick this person up.
I mean, it seems like it's almost making personality profiles of people, right? And pairing it against people. Going back to this idea of what data brokerages are doing is creating a digital twin of people and their interactions and their capabilities, right? And what we'll be looking for is now, deviations from their patterns, normal patterns, and they're right. From that kind of point of view, I can imagine this being a really powerful tool. Going back to the idea of personalization and this digital twin technology, right? If there ever was a capability for an individual to own their data set, right? I'm just thinking hypothetically here because I love this kind of stuff, right? If to own their own data set, I think what would be a cool point of view is a transactional layer between something like MinervaAI and that, right? It's almost like you're willingly giving away your data set and hey, look for intrusions against this, look for vulnerabilities against this, right? Look for how my data is being utilized against me, right? Because I think what we need to...
Monitor my digital thing and tell me if we have a problem. I know.
Sorry.
It's ironic and weird that you would have to give up so much of your identity in order to protect your identity. And I can think of, a lot of people would really get stuck on that. But it would be, in terms of identity theft and things like that, you would solve that problem much more quickly that way, I think.
Yeah, one of the projects I've been really following closely is Tim Berners-Lee, the father of the modern internet. He's doing a new project now, launching it out of CERN. It's calling it Solid. The Solid framework is a new protocol layer for the internet for apps. What it does is it decouples data from applications, right? So it allows companies to launch applications where the data is still owned by the underlying user, but still interfaces the technology. And I'm really hopeful for this protocol layer, because what it does is personalizes the data while still allowing companies to access it and deal with it. And he's creating something called pods, where individuals can have your own pod, like almost a vault of data. And as different companies utilize this, the pod becomes more and more enriched with better and better data of yourself. And my hope for this is, what allows companies like yourself to do, rather than just be institutions being your clients, individuals can become clients of this. Because I think at the end of the day, people are concerned of their data and how it's being utilized against them, and how bad actors can utilize their data against them, right? Especially as things get more and more sophisticated. And tools like what you have should be focused more now on the individual level rather than the institutional level, right, to protect the people. And I think we're going to need more of that in the future.
Yeah, I think it still cuts both ways for the individual or the consumer on that. So, in the world where I have my pod and where I'm retaining all of this information, and then that's where companies come to access it, how do I know they're only actually accessing the components that they need or that they are entitled to due to the nature of our business relationship? So that still gives me pause. And certainly there must be a way to have some more controls around that. If you wanted to engage a monitoring service to monitor your digital twin to see if there's any infringement, I think that is probably really interesting. As of today, I wouldn't sell a license to an individual to access Minerva, because that's her purpose is not, today her purpose is not that. Today her purpose is to identify financial crime or bad actors, and Joe down the street has no need to get in there and Minerva my name or yours or anybody else's. We've had a couple of calls where people are like, can I just buy a search? I'm like, yeah, no, you cannot. You cannot look up your I'm sorry.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. You'll have to
That's
do your.
that's
Oh, sorry.
yeah, yeah.
Go
No,
ahead.
definitely. I think we have a little bit of a lag here, but no, this has been great. Jen, I've learned so much from you. You just opened up a whole wealth of knowledge. We try to bring a lot of cybersecurity companies onto here, and I think you brought in a very unique perspective to the kind of risk factors that we are dealing with. And again, like I said, I think you're dealing with a very rich industry in the post-COVID world. I wish you guys the best, Minerva, and I love how you call her a she. Looking forward to how she becomes more and more advanced and becomes more utilized. And love the fact again, it's a Toronto-based company that's doing this.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been really fun. It's hard
Yeah.
talk about your business sometimes, or to make it to break it off into sort of ideas that are easy to discuss, rather than like, let's talk about the entirety of anti-money laundering legislation that would put most people to sleep. Yeah, I really love what we do. I think we're solving a really important problem. Most people know Minerva as the goddess of knowledge, but Minerva is also the goddess of defensive battle strategy, and that's why she's named Minerva, because it is defensive battle strategy. We need to be able to protect our financial systems from misuse, and by extension, the humans who pay the price on the other end.
Yeah. If I'm mistaken, Minerva is a Greek version of Artemis,
Yes,
the Artemis, the goddess Artemis. Yeah.
yeah, I
Cool.
think it is.
Perfect, Jen. Thank you so. Awesome. So we'll end the episode here. I think it's been a fun episode. I really learned a lot. Thank you so much for joining us. Stick around. We'll do a quick debrief. But for everyone who joined us, thanks. Check out Minerva AI. You can't buy it, but it's protecting you.
Unless you're a bank.